All right, let's resume. We have one session coming up with 3 talks, and we're very happy to have Manish Raghavan, who just won the ACM Doctoral Dissertation Award, I think. So congratulations. And he will be talking about reflections on incentivizing behavior through evaluation, which will give us a different perspective on the topic. Thanks.
All right, can everyone hear me? Great. Thanks for having me, and thanks for putting on such a good workshop. I'm excited to be here. Okay, so today I'm going to give you some perspectives on more of the sort of machine learning side of contract theory here, which is hopefully something that many of you may be familiar with. When the organizers asked me to give this talk, I wasn't quite sure what I would do, and I think I settled on what you'll see here, which is trying to think about what to do next when it comes to sort of joining together perspectives from computer science machine learning with the more traditional economic and contract theory perspectives. And so the motivation for the types of problems that I want to think about today come from stuff like the things that I've shown in the slide here, things like SAT scores, things like resumes and so on. These are situations where you are evaluated in some way. That evaluation creates incentives for you to behave in certain ways. And a decision maker cares about what you do, who you are, and what sort of changes that produces. So when you're applying to college, you are evaluated by your SAT score. You'll take certain actions perhaps to change your SAT score. Even things like credit scoring, you'll take actions to improve your credit score. And these may or may not affect the underlying thing that the decision maker is trying to measure. And that's where a lot of the challenge comes into play. And I want to sort of distinguish between 2 different perspectives that I think we've seen historically on these topics. One is a perspective that comes from more the economic side of things, and I think in line with the talks that we've seen so far. These are perspectives that think about incentivizing certain behaviors. So, for instance, if you think about the way that executives are compensated, a lot of the times your pay is sort of tied to the company's performance. You get stocks, right? And so this is an effort to, or this is an attempt to get you to invest effort in a productive way for the company, right? Trying to align incentives between the person and the job that they're trying to do. Now, I'll contrast that with the perspective from computer science, which came about in the early 2000s, I'll say, and sort of was more motivated by problems of like strategic classification, and spam detection was actually an early motivating example. And you can think of this as somewhat of a contract design problem where you announce some classifier or spam filter, and people are going to respond strategically when you tell them what that spam filter is going to be. So spammers are going to try to make it look like they're not in fact spammers. And so this is going to cause them to change their behavior, but fundamentally the assumption here is that this is an adversarial process. You're not trying to align the incentives between the email provider and the spammer. You're just trying to prevent their sort of nefarious activity from confusing you, right? And so these do seem to be different perspectives on the problem. And I would sort of characterize them as follows. Sort of this is trying to summarize what I've just said. The principal actually does care about some outcomes. So they care about in the executive compensation case, they care about how well the company is going to do. And they want to align incentives. They want to incentivize the agent to do the right thing. So in some sense, there's a positive spin on this story, where everyone can be made happy as long as we align incentives. Contrast that with the computer science view, where it's more taken to be this fixed ground truth, right? That there's adversarial behavior keeping you from getting at what is this underlying fixed ground truth. Now, we've seen these perspectives sort of blend in recent years, and I'm not trying to claim that they haven't. In fact, this is more a story about how they have. And I'm going to try to get at what I think are the elements of each one that are useful and what it looks like when we try to combine them together. And I think to do this, there's a few underlying concepts that are useful to clarify here. Right? In both of these cases, we have actions. Right? Agents are going to behave in certain ways. We also have observations. Right? So there's a decision maker, a principal, whatever we want to call them. They get to observe some things about what the agent does, what the agent produces, and so on. Right? Again, in the sort of traditional economic context, this is sort of performance, right? But in the machine learning context, this might be observable features of the principal or decision subject. And then there's this somewhat squishy concept, which I'm going to refer to as truth, but I don't think that's a great word, and I'd love to hear suggestions on this. But this is the thing that the decision maker actually cares about, right? And it's not obvious immediately what this is, right? Sometimes it's the actual production. Maybe they actually care about how well the company performs. Maybe they just care about whether the executive did as good a job as they could, which is somewhat distinct from what actually happened to the company. In the context of evaluating, for instance, in like a college admissions application, maybe the things you care about is preparedness for college. But we don't really know what that means, right? It's sort of a squishy concept that we never really fully pinned down. And in some sense, I'll call it a construct, right? A construct is something that we wish we could measure, and in an ideal world we would, but in practice we can't. Sometimes it's unmeasurable, sometimes it doesn't exist, sometimes we might even disagree about what it is. And so there's this thing floating around there, this construct of the truth, that we can't quite get at. And I think this actually should impact the way that we see these types of machine learning and contract theory relationships. This particular instantiation of a construct comes from a paper, I guess it was officially published in 2021, but it's been around for a while, which has really shaped, I think, a lot of people's thinking on this in the machine learning world. Okay, I'm going to try to draw sort of conceptual diagrams of how I see these problems and how I see them as being distinct from each other. I don't want you to interpret these as like any sort of formal causal diagram. This is just to help me organize my own thinking and I hope a useful map going forwards. So when I think about principal agent models from the more economic side of things, I see this following sort of flow, right? There's an agent who's going to behave in some way, and that's going to lead to the truth, this construct of the truth. And that's what the principal actually cares about. And there's some sort of noisy or stochastic relationship between the truth and the actual observations. And the decision maker, or the principal, observes something. They use a payment scheme or an evaluation scheme that translates into utility for the agent, right? So the agent cares about their utility as given by this scheme. The principal cares about this intermediate concept, though, of the truth, which, again, don't necessarily observe. To make this more concrete, let's think about a sort of moral hazard insurance case, right? So in the case of, we can think of health insurance, for instance, as a principal agent setting. And again, so you have actions. The agent is either going to behave in some safe way or not. Maybe you smoke or don't smoke. These are things that contribute to your health. But of course, the principal doesn't directly observe these things. And then there's some truth, right? There's some truth that your behavior produces, which is, let's say, the expected cost to the healthcare system that you incur. This is what the principal cares about in aggregate. They care about this for all the agents in the system. But of course, you don't observe expected cost. You observe realized costs, right? And so based on this realized cost, or your health outcomes, the principal will charge the agent some amount of money. This is what a deductible is, and whatever. This is how insurance works, right? And so this is the sort of flow of events in the principal agent setting, okay? Now, again, poor conceptual diagrams. These are not actual, I wouldn't stand by this as like the depiction of exactly what the field looks like. But when I think about the computer science and strategic classification world, it looks like it's flipped, okay? The way I see that literature is that there's a fixed ground truth, and this is what the principal cares about. Email is either spam or it's not, okay? And based on that ground truth, agents are going to act in different ways, right? They're going to manipulate the text or whatever, right? So they're going to act in different ways, and that's going to produce some observations. The principal is going to look at those observations, put some sort of classification scheme or payment scheme on top of it, and that payment or that classification is what the agent ultimately cares about. Okay, so again, it feels like this flipped view of the world where the truth is fixed and the actions stem from that as opposed to the other way around. And again, we can walk through this in the spam classification just to make it concrete. The truth is does this person want to create spam or not? The actions are how they manipulate the text in order to try to evade a spam filter. The observables are the realized text of an email, and then there's a classifier applied on top of that. This filters out some email as spam or not, and that's what the agent cares about. Okay, so if you notice, the difference between these two worlds is just these first two nodes appear to be flipped in my conceptual diagram. And so the types of models then I think that I'd like to think about, which I find super interesting at this interface between them, again, we have, just to put them both next to each other, the types of models that I think are useful to consider are where we try to combine the two. Okay, so where your actions can influence the truth, but the truth also influences how you behave. And so this sort of circular relationship exists. Or in some sense, I've taken both of the arrows that exist in the previous slide and put them together on this slide. Okay, and this introduces new challenges, I think. And these challenges can be quite interesting to think through. There's, of course, confounding, where different behaviors might lead to the same outcomes, and so we can't use outcomes to directly distinguish between behaviors. But there's also this challenge of the truth being mutable, right? Where the state of the world isn't fixed. People can improve, people can get better, and I actually want to be sensitive to that. And if I think about college admissions as a motivating example for this type of diagram that I've drawn up here, there's a few things that you can do when trying to get into college, right? You can do some test prep classes, you can pay attention in school and get good grades. There's all sorts of behaviors you can exhibit. Now, what's the truth? What is a college actually trying to evaluate you on? They're trying to evaluate you on your preparation for college. Squishy concept, it's a construct. We don't actually observe it, we don't know what it really means, but this is the thing that ostensibly you care about. Now, what are the observables? Things like your SAT score, your grades, and so on. These all are some combination of the actions that you take, but also sort of just general features about you and this ground truth that the principal actually cares about. Okay, so these are the types of settings that I think are particularly hard to reason about, and I think we need more and better models to do so. I'm going to present to you one such model, which came from a paper that John Kleinberg and I wrote a few years ago, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think that model is inadequate and what I think can be done on top of it. Okay, so the basic premise for this model is that there's a decision maker, which we'll call the principal, and a decision subject, which we'll call an agent. And the setup is going to be similar to one that you've seen in previous talks, where the principal announces a rule, and that rule is going to map observable features to outcomes. Right? It's an evaluation scheme, it's going to be public, it'll be known, and the agent gets to see it. Now, the agent cares about outcomes. They care about how much they're paid, or whether they're evaluated positively, or however we might choose to characterize it. And the agent has the opportunity to invest effort in order to manipulate these observable features. Okay? So they can study harder, they can go to test prep, whatever, but they can change the way that they look from the decision maker's perspective. But the principal has some preferences as well. Right? They care about this squishy ground truth construct that I've been so vague about. The way I'm going to instantiate that in this model, and we can talk about whether this is the right way to do it later, is that the principal actually has preferences over the agent's effort, over the actions that they take. For instance, the principal may prefer that you study for your classes and do better in school, as opposed to manipulate your SAT score by learning how to do well on the test without actually changing your college preparedness. Okay, so this is one such model. I'm going to be a little bit more formal about it, and we're going to walk through some of the main features of it just to see if we can get some ideas from it. And the way I'm going to set up this model is through sort of a graphical model, just for simplicity here. The way it's going to work is that there are some actions. Let's say there are M actions that the agent can take. They can do whatever they want. They have some budget that they can split among these actions. And these are private to the agent, so the decision maker, the principal, never gets to see what they're doing here. There are observable features. There are N of them. And these do get observed by the principal, and they are influenced by the actions that the agent takes. Now, the principal's job is to design an evaluation rule that says, given these features, here's what your score will be. And this is known to the agent. If we want to be formal, I can say, here's the actual mathematical relationship between actions and features. It's simply that each feature is a concave transformation of a linear combination of the features. It's not going to be super important exactly what that is right now, but it'll turn out to be necessary for some of the results that we have. I want to instantiate this in a setting that I think is perhaps the easiest to reason about. Let's call this the classroom setting, where there are two assignments in the class that I have to design grades for. These two assignments are the tests and the homework. Okay? And I have to design a grading scheme which is taking a student's test score and their homework score and give them a grade based on that. And there are three things that a student can do in my world. They can cheat on the tests, which is the top action, X1. They can cheat on the homework, which is action X3. Or they can study and actually learn the material, and that's action X2. And you notice that by the way that I've set this up, X2, studying the material, affects both your test score and your homework score. cheating on either assignment only affects one of them. Okay? And right away you can see that I might have preferences as a teacher over which actions my students take. In particular, I'd prefer that they didn't cheat on either assignment and that they actually just study the material. And so as a teacher, my question might be, when can I incentivize desirable behavior, right? All I get to do is set a grading scheme. And let's say we restrict ourselves to linear grading schemes for now. So I just say, you have to take, your grade will be some linear combination of your two assignments. Okay? How can I incentivize a student to do the thing that I want to do, which is to study? Now you might look at this and say, well, there's a very easy special case where that's possible, and that special case is where studying is much more effective than cheating. So per unit effort, studying actually takes me further than cheating. This is a case where I can incentivize students to study pretty easily. Now, the more relevant question to ask, though, it turns out to be, when can't we incentivize desirable behavior? When is it impossible to get students to study? And the short answer for this is that there's a substitutability argument that you can make that just says, whenever I could pull effort out of studying and reroute that effort into cheating, and still obtain higher scores, obviously I can't incentivize people to study. Okay, so this might seem like a fairly natural condition. This might be the first thing you think of. And the main result that we have in this work is actually to say that this is a tight condition. Right? Whenever effort isn't substitutable, there is a linear mechanism incentivizing that effort. And before we had said, let's for now restrict ourselves to linear mechanisms or to linear grading schemes, it turns out that that's sufficient in this setting. So we give a tight characterization, linear mechanisms suffice. Now the qualitative thing that's interesting about this, which I keep coming back to, is that multiple independent measurements are actually helpful. Right? It was helpful that I could measure whether a student had studied through both their homework score and their test score. That was what sort of enabled me to do anything in this setting. Okay, I'm going to walk quickly through the proof idea just to give you some idea of the math. For those of you who may have seen this proof before, I'll try to give some bonus material at the end on new ideas that I think could be useful in future work here. There's a close resemblance in what we do to the idea of implementable actions from the econ literature. And there's also what I would say is a fairly strong reliance on linearity assumptions, and that's something I'm going to talk about as we go. And the proof idea is actually fairly straightforward. It's to take this idea of substitutability that I mentioned to you and turn it into a linear program. All right, so that linear program is just saying, could I remove effort from one node, reroute it elsewhere, such that this constraint is just saying the feature values are non-decreasing when I do this. And this linear program is going to have some value to it. It turns out that when that value is less than 1, any particular action is substitutable and can't be incentivized. Okay, I'm going to do this proof for a single action. You can do this for sets of actions, actually, and that's what the main result really is, but just for simplicity, let's stick with this. And so this is how I would draw out this linear program working. It's just saying if I could take 1 unit of effort out of x2 and replace it by 1/3 of a unit on each of x1 and x3, then I've spent 2/3 the amount of effort, but I've kept my feature values the same, and therefore I've done some substitution. Okay? And now the trick to this, and the last piece of it, is just to say, what happens when we take the dual to this linear program? It turns out that that gives you actually weights on all the features that incentivize the thing that you want to incentivize. Okay? Well, you did have to do a little massaging, but that's basically the main idea. Now, the thing that I find, actually, that I wish we had done more on, but we ran out of time before the deadline, is actually what happened, is there's another proof approach that I think could be more broader than this one that might work in a variety of cases, and that's the following. Consider a process that gets induced by these best response dynamics, which is principal announces a rule, agent responds to that rule, principal updates the rule, agent responds, and so on, right? You can think of making this well-defined so that things are unique. And this, you can run this process for a while and you can ask what's going to happen to it. Okay, does it converge? And if so, what does it converge to? And it turns out you can get very close to proving the theorem that I just mentioned to you simply with a fixed point argument. That just says, this has got to converge somewhere, and I can prove something nice about where it must converge. And that actually gives you an existence proof of a class or of an evaluation scheme that does the thing that you want it to do. Okay, it's not constructive because these fixed point theorems tend not to be, but you might be able to get existence proofs for a slightly broader category of settings. And so if you're interested, feel free to talk to me more about this. But I think this is a valid strategy modulo the bugs that we had in the version that we almost submitted. Okay, so I've given you some of the technical details. I really think, though, that the most interesting thing for me now is sort of the what to do next, right? What is wrong with this model? Because clearly this model doesn't actually tell you what's going on in the world. So what would you do differently, right? Or how could you make this better? Well, one thing that some people in this room have done is observe that this model is for a single agent. Obviously, there are multiple agents in the world, and there's heterogeneity. What would you do differently if there are multiple agents? Great paper. Read this if you want to know the answer. Another thing that you might worry about, though, is that I gave you a pretty simplified view of the relationship between actions and ground truth, or that construct that I keep referring to, right? What I assumed was that there are certain actions that are desirable, there are certain actions that are not, and as long as we get people to do the things that are desirable, that's good enough, right? But that's not always the case. Maybe we have preferences over actions that are more than just binary. Maybe it matters how much time you spend on each action. Maybe there's diminishing returns on them. Maybe there's some more complex utility function that the decision maker has over these actions, right? This would require a much more complex model, perhaps more information from the part of the principal, but it's doable. And I think it's a valid set of questions to ask. The next thing that you might look at this model and try to tweak is the fact that there's actually a fairly limited and known structural model that I'm requiring here, right? I said there's this graph, and effort propagates into features according to this graph, and importantly, this has to be known to the decision maker, right? What if it isn't known? And so there's some work on trying to learn causal models as you do this sort of strategic classification exercise. I think there's a lot more to be done there. Again, the more assumptions you relax, maybe the more information you need, or maybe the worse you can do, the worse guarantees you can give, but there's still some trade-offs to be explored there. Okay, and now I want to briefly talk about a few open questions as I wrap up here. I think there's a few features of these types of strategic classification models that should inform the way that we construct them going forwards. First, I want to talk a bit about transparency, right? I made this assumption, and this is sort of an assumption that gets made a lot in the contract theory world, especially, which is that there's perfect information, right? That the agent fully knows how they're going to be evaluated, right? Now, this makes a lot of sense if you're actually writing a contract. This doesn't make as much sense necessarily in a machine learning setting where, yeah, maybe you know what the model is, maybe you have some idea what the model is, but that idea is probably not perfect, and it sort of depends on how much that's going to be explained. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how multiple decisions might interact. We'll revisit this idea of the ground truth again, because, again, I think that it's sort of the key to understanding how strategic classification should really work. And then thinking about questions of fairness and equity under strategic behavior, which is something that, again, people in this room have been engaged in, and I think it's worth spending more time on going forwards. So let's talk a little bit about transparency. Right, there's a basic question about what agents know. What are they supposed to know? And what happens when they don't know everything, right? And so there's work on what happens with partial information, right? What happens when agents don't have full information about the sort of classifier that's being used. But I think this actually ties into questions about explainability. Because if we're thinking of explaining models to people as a way to give them information about how those models work, this should influence the way that we think about explanation techniques. Perhaps different ways of explanation lead to different forms of strategic behavior. Perhaps there's things that you do and don't want to disclose about a model for the sake of the strategic behavior that it induces. Okay, so there's all sorts of questions, I think, around this idea of transparency and explanations that should feed back into these strategic classification models. Okay, let's think a little bit about multiple decisions. So in this setting, we often think about a single decision maker and maybe a single agent or multiple agents that we did here in the previous talk about what happens when you try to expand that a bit. There's a few sort of directions you can go from here. One is that each individual is subject to multiple decisions, right? And perhaps you want it to be the case that things that are beneficial for someone to do for one decision, they're actually beneficial in multiple ways, right? And there's actually, I should have included the reference actually. There's a piece by Virginia Eubanks in her book where she talks about how the way that you're evaluated for sort of social welfare benefits in the US might actually disincentivize you from using those benefits in the first place because it's viewed negatively when it comes to getting future benefits. Okay, so we should be careful when we think about how these, the incentives that we produce interact with multiple decisions. There's also questions around, instead of multiple sort of sequential decisions, we should think about multiple parallel decisions. And what I mean by that is often we have multiple decision makers that are competing for us in some way. Like college admissions is not just you and one decision maker, it is you and multiple competing decision makers. And so you could imagine that that heterogeneity would actually be good for you, but it also depends on the extent to which these decision makers are correlated. If they have access to the same feature sets, if they have very similar objectives, that heterogeneity doesn't actually mean very much. So John and I have a paper on sort of thinking about these monoculture effects of having multiple correlated decision makers. And I think the same questions are valid in this context, where if different decision makers are making decisions about me, does it matter how independent they are? Okay? If we talk again a bit about this ground truth, right? I don't really know what to do with it, right? This question of what does the decision maker actually care about, it often doesn't get operationalized, right? I actually had a conversation at lunch yesterday with someone talking about a policy to prioritize people for social welfare benefits, and there was a sense that people wanted to prioritize by vulnerability, okay? What does that mean? What does it mean that the ground truth is vulnerability, and how does this sort of encode different people's normative values, right? So I think this is sort of a basic question that we should ask in practice that we don't really know, we don't really have the language to express just yet as to what is this ground truth that we care about, how is it related to people's behavior, how is it related to what we observe, and is there, maybe given certain observations, it's actually not quite possible to maximize or optimize for our true values. Okay, and finally there's questions about equity and fairness, right? Because in the real world, people have different capacities to behave strategically, right? And there's a series of great papers here that I think explore this question well. There's differences in people's access to information. There's differences in people's resources. There's also differences in people's goals and objectives, right? And so to the extent that people have different strategic behaviors, we need to think hard about designing classifiers and designing evaluation schemes that work well for everybody or that balance utility in some sort of socially responsible way. I could have gone on about any of these other further directions. I could have extended the list further down. I really think there's a lot of sort of open green space in this area. I'm going to wrap up with this, though, and looking forward to any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Manish. So we can maybe have a quick question while the next speaker sets up. Yep.
I have seen that some problem whose solutions existence depending on the fixed point problem may have PPAD complexity. So I am curious about the running efficiency of your algorithm theoretically or empirically.
Yeah, so any of the fixed point arguments I think are non-constructive, so you shouldn't hope to get an algorithm out of them. I think it's more just a question of can we get even existence proofs of what's possible and what's not possible to do. So I think of it as just sort of a theoretical question as opposed to practically, here's how you would build a classifier.
Oh, but practically, how long will your problem run?
Which problem are you talking about? So the first proof I gave you was constructive, and so just as long as you can solve a linear program, you can solve it. The second proof idea I gave you is non-constructive, and so won't give you anything other than a yes/no answer as to whether something exists.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, so let's thank Manish again. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.